subsidy that is not profitable at all. And again, I am not against the biofuel itself. I am against using taxpayer monies going to not-for-profit organizations to promote this. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from South Dakota rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, essentially what this amendment does, Mr. Speaker, is it eliminates an extremely effective program. Biodiesel is a clean-burning product that's produced by a mix of feedstocks, including soybean oil, waste grease, and recycled animal fats. The byproducts of biodiesel is protein, a meal that is often made from soy and is used as livestock feed. It's a protein-rich livestock feed as well. The more animal fat as biodiesel feedstock demand increases, livestock value increases, and this program is a grant education that's used to educate engine manufacturers, fleet operators, the public on the benefits of biodiesel. The program plays a vital role in making sure and helping expand marketplace acceptance and the use of biodiesel as a low-carbon renewable diesel replacement fuel. Mr. Speaker, what this amendment simply does is it doesn't save any money. What it does is it eliminates a program that is out there telling the story of what an all of the above energy supply means that prioritizes American energy. We absolutely need to make sure that we are prioritizing the types of energy that we can produce in this country right here from renewable sources as well as petroleum products. I'm a farmer and a rancher. I utilize petroleum products every single day in our operation. But I also recognize the value in being able to have a program that promotes the use of renewable sources that we can generate and prioritize over other sources that come from other countries. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield 1 minute to Mr. King from Iowa, if he'd like to speak as well.
I thank the gentlelady from South Dakota for yielding to me and wanted to come to the floor in opposition also of this amendment. I've seen what this research does. And I've watched as we've gone from no industry to an industry now that's utilizing the products that the gentlelady from South Dakota has said, from animal fats to for soy oil, and it has cheapened up our energy supply, and it has cleaned up our air, and it's made us a better country because of it. And this research that gets done, we should remember that there isn't always a return on that research investment. That's why we do research. That's why we do research in our universities, for example. And so with that research, we can find those things that make us more efficient. I remember when the research lab said it was impossible to get the energy out of the feed grains that we now turn into energy. We've exceeded that because of research. And to utilize these animal fats has dramatically been changed, a lot because of the research that takes place here with this fund. So I think this is a piece that we need to preserve so that we can preserve the efficiency that's there, we can preserve the education. I yield back to the gentlelady from South Dakota.
Yields back to the gentlelady from South Dakota.
You know, Mr. Speaker, that is one of the things that we don't talk about enough, is the fact that this research brings us benefits and cost savings in many other industries that we see reflected every day, such as lower costs in energy areas, also lower costs in livestock feeds. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield a minute to Mr. Peterson from Minnesota if he would like to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentlelady, and I too oppose this amendment. You know, people need to realize that the diesel engine was invented by a German fellow named Diesel, and it ran on peanut oil. It didn't run on diesel fuel. And the internal combustion engine ran on ethanol. It didn't run on gasoline. And they had to re-engineer those motors to get them to run on gasoline and diesel fuel. It takes a different type of engine to run those kinds of fuel. And one of the things you do with this type of a program is you help those manufacturers develop engines that can utilize the fuel. You know, same thing with the car engines. Down in Brazil, they're burning 30% ethanol. With cars that are made by General Motors, you know, that are engineered to run on that fuel, and they get better mileage with that 30% ethanol than they get with gasoline because they engineered the engines right. You know, and that's what we're trying to do with this program, is help the industry be able to utilize these fuels which are renewable and are made by Americans and are creating jobs. So this is a good program, and I oppose the amendment.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from South Dakota.
Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I reserve, and if my colleague is ready to close, then...
The gentlelady from South Dakota, a member of the committee, has the right to close. So the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for
How much time
2
do I
minutes.
have?
2 minutes.
You know, and once again, I'm not against the use of biofuels. I'm against the use of taxpayer dollars going to not-for-profit organizations to promote the use of biofuels. There is not one vehicle that runs 100% on biofuel that I know of at this point. And it does save money, if this program is eliminated, of hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars per year. And that money should go back into the taxpayer's pocket, or at least pay the debt down. You know, we should use taxpayer dollars to create jobs, like building the XL Keystone Pipeline, like developing natural gas exploration that we have an abundant supply of. So let's stop borrowing money to promote a product where we pick the winners and losers. As I said earlier, that's up to the consumer. They can choose what best product to use. But I just oppose the fact that hard-working, middle-class taxpayer dollars are going for propaganda and advertising, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from South Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly appreciate the gentleman's concerns and all those that he brought to this House today. I will just reiterate that this is an extremely effective program. What it does is it lets the consumers know that they do have a choice. It lets them know about the benefits of the fuel, lets them know that it actually can have an impact on their efficiency levels that they are able to enjoy within their engines, that it gives them another market that they can go to lower their energy costs. It lowers our livestock feed costs. What this program essentially does is it goes out there and it tells the consumer that there are options that are renewable right here in the United States, that we can grow, that we can produce, and that we can put out there in the marketplace that will actually be something that's sustainable without the volatility of relying on the Middle East for our energy needs. I will reiterate that this program does not have a cost score as it relates to the underlying bill. Even though that was mentioned in some of the comments, there will be no money saved in the underlying bill if this amendment is adopted, and that is why I oppose it, because of the effectiveness of the program, and ask that we would oppose this amendment when it comes to a vote.
Lady yield.
Absolutely, I will.
I just wanted to say that
The gentlelady has expired.
Willie Nelson's bus runs on B100.
Yeah, there we go.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and amendment is not agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 42, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 43, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 43, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment addresses a very simple question. Why are we spending millions of dollars advertising and promoting farmers' markets? The Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Program spends $40 million on such trivialities as redecorating farmers' market stalls and roadside stands to attract yuppie customers. In Colorado, funds from this program paid for a chef competition and bike tour. More than $120,000 in 2 grants under this program was spent for beer seminars in China. This program duplicates 4 other federal programs that also promote various aspects of farmers' markets, and God knows how many state and local programs that also do the same thing. My amendment simply eliminates this program. I would challenge the supporters of the program to answer 3 questions. First, why should a taxpayer in Latimer, Iowa, for example, pay for a farmer in Lancaster, California to advertise his produce? Second, why should a shopkeeper in Lancaster who has to pay for his own advertising also pay for the local farmer's advertising as well? And third, and most importantly, how can any member look his or her constituents in the eye and tell them that a beer seminar in China was worth spending more of their earnings than they make in a year? We keep hearing how draconian is the sequester. We keep hearing how it's cutting deeply into vital public services. I dare say at least a dozen speeches on this floor this week were dedicated to the painful cutbacks caused by the sequester. We tell school children they can't tour the White House because we don't have the money due to the sequester. We tell our constituents that they'll have to wait in insufferable lines just to see us in the House office buildings because we don't have the money due to the sequester. And yet, we seem to have plenty of money to fund travesties like those that are crammed into this farm bill. Doesn't that bother anybody here? I believe that rooting out wasteful programs like this one is the principal reason that voters entrusted Republicans with majority control of the House that's supposed to hold the purse strings of this government. I ask my colleagues if we're being true to our campaign promises that we made to our constituents by continuing to fund such obscene wastes of their money as this one. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Maine rise?
Mr. Speaker, to claim the time in opposition.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this amendment and want to speak in favor of the Farmers Market Promotion Program. I have a very different perspective, and while I appreciate my colleagues' opposition or concerns raised about the sequester, I do not think those same concerns apply to what is a very good program. You know, when I moved to Maine about 40 years ago and started a small farm, growing and selling healthy food, locally grown food, was a little bit out of the mainstream. We'd gone in a different direction. But I can tell you today, wherever I go, whether I'm talking to a group of bankers or a group of school teachers or a group of school kids or their parents, people nod in very strong support when I say we need to have more locally grown, sustainable food. People want to know where their food comes from. They want to see farmers in their communities. They want to help those farmers make ends meet. This amendment would take us backwards. It would further undo our weakened infrastructure of local food support. The Farmers Market Promotion Program, which is reformed in this bill to be the Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Program, helps communities support local food systems through direct marketing. They're not price guarantees. They're not income support. This helps farmers understand the best practices for marketing their food. It helps them understand how to get the best price from the market for their product in this growing opportunity that truly supports rural communities. It's not an either-or proposition. You don't have to have just locally grown food or nationally grown food. You can support regrowing our local food infrastructure, helping rural communities, and also support conventional agriculture. You can buy California lettuce and also buy in-season tomatoes from the farmers who live down your road and support your community. The truth is, I come from a state like Maine, and Maine is like many other states around the country. We have very, very few farmers who will be able to take advantage of the biggest programs in this bill, the biggest programs that are worth billions of dollars, the revenue loss program, the price loss program, the stacked income protection plan. They don't apply to farmers in my state. They get very little support to help these growing opportunities in rural communities. That's okay with them. They're not asking for a price guarantee. They're asking for some parity, for USDA programs to once and finally apply to them. They're not asking to be at a tremendous disadvantage because they are diversified and sustainable farmers, people who live and work in rural communities, whose kids go to our school, who serve on local boards, who are part of the rural fiber of our country. That's all this program is asking for, a little bit of parity, a little bit of assistance in this billion-dollar program for big corporate farms. I cannot imagine how anyone could come to the floor and say, I don't want to help the fiber and fabric of rural states like mine. Programs like Cultivating Community, which helped promote 6 local farm stands in low-income areas. This program helps people to support farm stands that accept SNAP benefits, that do a tremendous amount of things to get more people eating healthy local food and promoting them. As I said, it's a critical part of our local infrastructure. I can't imagine why anyone would go against that. And I'll pause there and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentleman from California.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlelady from Maine.
Georgia.
I'll reserve. Oh, Scott. Oh.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm happy to allocate half a minute.
Yes, ma'am.
Or a minute.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this amendment as well, and while we all share the desire to get rid of the fraud, the waste, and abuse, I think we've reached a delicate balance in the committee with the language that we've done here. This is a competitive grant process. It will improve direct producer-to-consumer market opportunities, and I think it's very valuable for our small farms and our small communities. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you.
The gentleman from California has a right to close. The gentlelady from Maine is recognized.
I will continue to reserve unless the gentleman is ready to close. I would just like to say one more time, this is a vital program. Let me again reinforce the good words of my colleague and thank him for speaking on the other side of the aisle in support of this program. This helps communities through direct marketing. This helps roadside stands, farmers markets, CSA, agritourism, other direct producer-to-consumer marketing opportunities. It's a competitive grant. It's not a boondoggle. It's not direct payments to a farmer. And once again, I just want to say, I come from the state of Maine, which, like many states, is full of rural communities who are seeing this renewed interest in buying food locally, a great way to expand this economy, to provide jobs, to get more money into our rural economies, to make sure people are eating healthier food, getting to know their farmers in their communities, making better, healthier decisions. I strongly oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to do so, and I thank you very much for the time.
Gentlelady yields back her time.
I yield back my second.
Gentleman yields back her time. Gentleman from California. 2 1/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I began by asking the supporters to answer 3 simple questions. Why should a taxpayer in one community pay to advertise produce for a farmer in another community? I heard no answer. I asked, why should a shopkeeper in one community who has to pay for his own advertising also pay for the local farmer's advertising as well? I heard no answer. And third, I asked, how can any of us look our constituents in the eye and tell them that $120,000, more than our constituents, most of them make in a year, is a worthwhile expenditure to hold a beer seminar in China? And once again, I heard no answer. I forgive my Democratic colleagues the error of their ways. They never promised to be careful with the people's money. The Republicans made that promise, and because of that promise, the Republicans were entrusted with the majority of this House. Allowing programs like this to continue on our watch dishonors those promises, and I appeal to my Republican colleagues not to repeat the conduct that turned the nation's stomach the last time we held the majority. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from California. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 44, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 44, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Gibson of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gibson, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a bipartisan amendment addressing some underlying language in the bill pertaining to olive oil, advanced by my good friends from California and Georgia, and who are here today to defend and to advance their olive growers. They're very proud of them, and I just want to say how proud I am of their olive growers as well, and also to address fraud. And I want to also express my commitment to combating fraud as well. But regrettably, this underlying language misses the mark. In fact, it's going to significantly drive up costs. It's going to cost hundreds, in fact thousands of jobs across America, including hundreds of jobs in my home state. I think it's important to focus in on what this underlying language does. We should face the facts that, at least at the moment, 98% of the olive oil that we consume in America is imported from overseas. And in fact, we've got hundreds of jobs in New York State that deal with that. But 98% of the olive oil imported, and the underlying language will require 100% of that 98% to be chemical and taste tested at the port. I mean, now you have about 5 to 8% that's spot checked. We're talking about going to 100%, and I don't even think the United States government has the capacity to do that. And I certainly would fear if it ended up with that capacity to do that. Look, the way that we should deal with fraud is strike this language. We should look to the FDA for standards. We did this in New York. We have standards in New York. The olive oil distributors are happy to are certainly complying with it. They were part of making it come about. But what we've done in this underlying bill, I want to make sure it's very clear that this is going to drive up costs for all of our consumers, millions of dollars according to the CBO, and we're going to end up crushing jobs. So with that, I want to reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Time for what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Claim time in opposition of the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, please.
Gentleman yields 2 minutes to the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After 3 debates in support of my colleague from New York, I find myself on the opposite side of this issue. We are in the process of developing a very viable American olive oil industry, one that has great potential. At the same time, that industry faces a question from the consumers about the quality of the oil that's available, both domestically produced as well as internationally produced. There have been numerous studies done that indicate that there is a lot of misrepresentation as to the quality and the nature of olive oil. This bill, the Farm Bill, simply establishes the opportunity for the creation of a marketing order that would eventually provide a farmer-oriented regulation of the quality and the type of olive oil that's going to be on the market. That would apply both to imported as well as domestically produced olive oil. The cost of this need not be as high as my colleague from New York suggests. It is probable and most feasible that the olive oil that's imported would be checked as to its quality and consistency at the point of export, certainly not at the retail, and probably not at the point of import. And this can be done. This is done in many, many products that are produced in America as well as imported. Quality controls, consumer awareness. This is a very important bill for the domestic and nascent olive oil industry. With that, I will yield back my remaining time.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from New York.
At this time, I'd like to recognize my colleague, Mr. Meeks from New York, for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and today I rise to demonstrate my strong support for this amendment, led by my colleague from New York, Mr. Gibson, to strike the olive oil price increase. This amendment is needed to stop the unnecessary increase in olive oil pricing. The unfair marketing order being considered would place heavy restrictions and burdens on the importation of olive oil. The United States is the largest importer of oil, importing approximately 95% of the olive oil Americans consume. The marketing order would result in tens of millions of dollars of cost for inspections a year, in turn raising the price of olive oil and making it incredibly expensive. The inspection would occur only when it is produced, not once the product enters the United States. This tax on American consumers will hinder trade and undermine our international trade relations. It is clearly a non-tariff trade barrier which will further complicate U.S. trade and export relations with our transatlantic partners. Just this week, the President has launched the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. This provision is against the spirit of the talks and trade with our largest trading partner. Currently, the European Union free trade talks will be compromised, resulting in the loss of greater U.S. exports, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to strike the olive oil price.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Oregon.
I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this amendment. In this current Farm Bill, the olive oil provision will simply require that both domestic and imported olive oil be subject to the same labeling requirements. Let me restate that. The same labeling requirements for domestic and imported olive oil. Americans deserve to know that the product that is advertised on the label is the product that they are buying when they're pulling it off the shelf. And as the gentleman from New York stated, it is spot checked right now. Less than 5% of the 98% of the oil sold in this country is actually checked as whether or not it is labeled accurately. U.S. growers and ethical importers have a strong interest in developing this program of cost-effective solutions to ensure safe and high-quality standards for the consumer. And with that, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. LaMaffa from California.
The gentleman from Oregon has the time.
I yield the remainder of my time back to the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back his time to the gentleman from Oregon.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to my friend, Mr. Hanna from New York.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Hanna, is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank my friend from New York for yielding and for his work on this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this bipartisan amendment to strike the new trade barrier on imported olive oil included in this Farm Bill. This would place a new effective tax rate on olive oil imports, which hurts small businesses like restaurants, retailers, and especially consumers. It will seriously threaten good jobs in many communities, including my own. Roughly 98% of the olive oil consumed in the United States is imported. Only 2% is produced here. This new barrier would benefit a very small segment of the olive oil producers in very few states at the expense of all 50 states. CBO pegged the new olive oil regulation as a private sector mandate, an earmark effectively, potentially costing businesses and consumers tens of millions of dollars. Now is not the time to implement trade barriers with our allies as we begin new trade negotiations with the European Union. This amendment protects small business, consumers, and robust trade. I urge support of this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Oregon.
Yes, I'd like to yield the remaining portion of my time to the other gentleman from California, Mr. LaMaffa.
The gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I must rise in opposition to this measure from my colleagues from New York. My family, olive oil was something that was very heavily used, being of Italian descent, and we purchased it locally in Northern California by vendors just right nearby. We'd always got top quality oil. And so I think we need to have that same opportunity for everybody across the country, not just the opportunity to buy the oil, but to know that the advertising, the labeling of it is correct. Unfortunately, much imported oil does not have to meet the same standards for labeling, either using European standards or ours, especially by the time it's shipped here. So what we're looking for is not knocking out jobs or knocking out imported oil or any of that. It's just simply the truth in labeling that people would expect. When a label says extra virgin, then what should be in that container should be extra virgin. So unfortunately, much of it by the time it gets here is rancid. People would like to know maybe if the label should say extra rancid. So this is not what we're after here, is causing problems for our friends that would like to bottle and market it, but more just the truth in advertising that's necessary. There shouldn't be anything to worry about if you're an importer if your oil is meeting that standard. reasonable standards could be worked out for what the testing is. So let's move forward with blocking this amendment for today and instead allowing a good labeling standard to be in place for American olive oil users, whether it's domestic or imported. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this and ask for people to deny this amendment today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time to the gentleman from Oregon, the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, can I inquire how much time I have remaining?
The gentleman from New York has 1 minute remaining, and the gentleman from Oregon has 1 minute remaining and has the right to close. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield my last minute to my good friend from New York, Mr. Grimm.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, and I thank my colleague from New York. I respect my colleagues from California and from Georgia, but let's just stop the nonsense and call it what it is. I have a district that consumes more Greek oil and Italian oil than you can ever imagine, and it's not rancid. They don't have any problems. The producers here are the ones with the problems. Okay, the people buying it, the distributors, all the different restaurants that their costs would go up exponentially, they know good oil, and they haven't had a problem. There have been, of course, there's always going to be a problem in every industry, but this is nothing more than a multi-million-dollar earmark. So let's call it what it is. I respect the fact that they're sticking up for their states, but olives, just like oranges are tested, but we don't test orange juice. Grapes are tested, but we don't test the wine. So we do test olives. We shouldn't be testing olive oil. It would be the only manufactured good tested as a commodity. That would be a mistake. And as the CBO, even the CBO says, tens of millions of dollars in cost. We can't afford that for our jobs throughout the country. We can't afford that for our industry. This is a specialty earmark. I respect the intent, but it is bad policy, and I would ask everyone to oppose. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield 1 minute to the other gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for the last minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a marketing order. The underlying law establishes a marketing order. A marketing order allows the producers to come together and decide how they're going to market their product. Do it in a way that sets up standards for their product. This is common across virtually every aspect of American agriculture. This is nothing new. When you have a marketing order that involves imported as well as domestically produced, those imports are also affected by the qualifications and the standards set on that marketing order. This is not new. In fact, virtually everything you'll find in the produce, including many of the products that were described a moment ago, are controlled by a marketing order. We're not exactly sure until the marketing order what kind of regulations and quality standards will be put in place. But once they're in place, then whether it's an imported or a domestically produced oil, they'll have to abide by the same regulations. With regard to the cost, this is not new either. This happens in virtually most of the kinds of commodities and products that are imported and produced domestically. We're not talking about something radical.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from New York.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. She's here. It is now in order to consider amendment number 45, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk would designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment number 45, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Mrs. Walorski of Indiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentlelady from Indiana, Mrs. Walorski, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to prevent the Christmas tree tax from taking effect. This amendment prevents President Obama's proposed Christmas tree tax from being implemented. The administration already tried to enforce this tax right before the Christmas season in 2011, but in response to a resounding outcry from the American people, the tax was put on hold. When I'm at home in Indiana, I hear from Hoosier families firsthand about their daily struggles due to the sluggish economy. Moms and dads, single parents who are struggling to make ends meet, to pay their monthly bills, pay their mortgage, and still have enough left in their budget to put food on the table and fill up the gas tank. Americans are seeking common-sense solutions from Washington to jumpstart the economy, to provide more jobs, and ensure that our children and grandchildren have the same opportunities that we enjoy in this great nation. And now, as we focus on passing a comprehensive 5-year farm bill, some of my colleagues are looking to revive this unnecessary tax. There's no justification to impose another tax on the American people. There's certainly no justification to impose a tax on a commodity that symbolizes a historic Christmas tradition to many American families. The administration has denied that this is a quote-unquote tax. But I think most Americans would agree that when the federal government forces us to pay something, it's a tax. A tax imposed on every American family the next time they go to pick out a Christmas tree. Christmas tree growers opposed to this tax cannot opt out. This tax will be charged to the grower, passed on to the consumer, adding to the cost printed at the bottom of your receipt and increasing the amount of your hard-earned dollars owed to the federal government. Supporters of this tax will call it nominal and argue that it's only 15 to 20 cents. But with around 33 fresh-cut Christmas trees sold in the U.S. each year, this little tax adds up to millions of dollars in tax revenues. Our families save up for months to provide gifts for their families, donate to charities, or purchase a flight home to spend the holidays with their loved ones. This is not the time to raise taxes on our hardworking families, especially during the Christmas season. The President and Congress should instead focus on reducing government spending and finding common-sense solutions to lower taxes to provide relief for Americans. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to make sure that our Christmas trees remain a symbol of Christmas and the holiday spirit, not a symbol of more big government taxation. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Oh, I reserve, Mr. Chairman,
Pardon, the gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Claim time in opposition, please.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight. With all due respect, the good and gentle lady from Indiana is completely and totally misinformed as to what this Christmas tree checkoff bill does. If we were to strip this out of the farm bill, millions of Americans would lose jobs. This is about protecting American agriculture. I did not see the gentlelady or any of her friends on the other side of the aisle get up and talk about the beef checkoff program or the dairy checkoff program or the cotton checkoff program, all of which help promote American industry and American jobs and American research. The idea that this is a tax is absolutely ludicrous, with all due respect. This is a fee that the industry has come to us, just like the cattlemen did, just like the cotton growers did, just like the dairymen did, to help promote their industry. Perhaps the gentlelady is unaware of the fact that the Christmas tree industry is under siege in this country. What's more American than Christmas? Well, you know what's happening? The Chinese are exporting to our country, and we are importing fake Chinese trees. That's devastating the American industry right now. Now, we can be in favor of Chinese jobs, or we can be in favor of American agriculture jobs and silviculture jobs. This is pretty straightforward, folks. I mean, this is something that's not new. It's been done for years and years. And I think it's ridiculous to assume, with all due respect again, gentlelady's talking points talked about this Christmas season. Well, I don't think it's Christmas season. We are now into June. I mean, it's time to get updated and understand where this country is coming from. American agriculture has worked hard trying to stay competitive. What are the states that are going to be affected if we don't do this? What are the states that are going to be affected? We got North Carolina. You got Tennessee, you got Michigan, you got Washington, you got Oregon, you've got, I could go on, Pennsylvania. All 50 states produce Christmas trees. Now, this industry needs to survive. This is an American industry producing Christmas trees. I'm shocked, actually, that there's anyone that's willing to take this off the agenda. And I guess I would like to reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana rise?
Mr. Chairman, to consume the rest of my time, can I inquire on the rest of my time?
2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, with all due respect to the gentleman and his point on all these quote-unquote checkoffs, this is a tax that's that the American people themselves resoundingly in 2011 have said absolutely not. In fact, the American people put so much pressure on President Obama, he actually backed off and rescinded this and moved it into a different time slot, which is what we're looking at today. And with the people in my district, these are hardworking Americans that are double-income households, single moms with kids under the age of 18 that are trying to raise up households. They're trying to pay for their bills, they're trying to pay their mortgage, and they're trying to put gas in their car. And I think that we have a government in Washington that's out of control when it comes to taxation, and we don't need another tax coming out of Washington. We need help for American families. And with that, I would again urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the rest of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
And how much time do we have left?
2 3/4 minutes.
All right. I guess I would like to, again, continue to set the record straight. The American people did not vote in any way, shape, or form on this promotion and research program for American Christmas trees. If they had, I think they would vote in favor of American agricultural jobs in rural America. Rural America, I don't know if the gentlelady knows this, but with the unemployment rate in rural America is easily still in the double digits. This is an industry that needs severe help at our time. If the American government can't come to their aid by letting them assess themselves a fee that is overwhelmingly supported by the industry to keep it alive, to keep it producing American jobs, I don't know what our government's all about at the end of the day. This should be a straightforward no vote on this amendment. Matter of fact, this was so non-controversial in the Agriculture Committee in which I served that it passed unanimous en bloc. This was not a controversial issue. So I guess I'd like to think that we've moved forward out of the election season. It's now time to get real. It's now time to put some jobs on the table for Americans, particularly in rural America. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I would just like to add, as I close, that this is a time, and I agree with the gentleman in one sense, this is a time for us to be talking here about things like jobs and a struggling, sluggish economy. And because of that, the hardworking people in my district, the last thing they expect to see, the last thing they want to see, and Americans did resoundingly cry out in 2011 that not to send another tax their way. This is a tax. When the federal government says to Americans, you must pay X, that's a tax. And in my district, it's hardworking Hoosiers that have resoundingly said no more taxes from this government. They're taxed enough, and they don't want to be taxed at the Christmas season. And I would again urge my colleagues to stand in support for this amendment, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I guess what I would like to close with here is that again, I can't say it often enough and more accurately enough, this is nothing about taxation. This is about the promotion of an industry that we would like to support in America, Christmas. What's more American than Christmas? I can't believe the opposition is seeking to attack Christmas and Christmas tree producers. It's tough out there. The recession isn't over. The recession isn't over in rural America right now. Over 70% of the folks in the Christmas tree industry easily favor this bill. Man, I'd love to see my approval rating come even up to 15 or 20%. These guys are at 70% wanting to get something done. I think we owe it to them to back them. The producers across this country, they need our help. They did it for beef, we did it for dairy, we've done it for cotton, we've done it for a number of other industries. I don't see why Christmas trees should be discriminated against, and we should be encouraging Chinese jobs and Chinese fake trees in our Christmas tree pageants. I think that's terrible, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman has yielded back. Does the gentleman reserve, or does it?
I will yield my time back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Indiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Request to record a vote, Mr. Chairman.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Indiana will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 46, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment number 46, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Mr. Courtney of Connecticut.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bipartisan amendment, which I've introduced with my friend Mr. Whitman from Virginia, is a budget-neutral amendment. It does not change any authorized level of spending. It very simply adds shellfish farming to the Specialty Crops Competitive Grants Act programs, the block grants and the Crop Research Initiative, which is, again, I think a reasonable addition given the history of the Block Grants and Research Initiative program prior to 2004. Again, I want to just emphasize at the outset, what we're talking about here is shellfish farming. We are not talking about fishing. Shellfish farming is cultivated process from seed, which many instances starts offshore and proceeds to harvest in beds, again, just adjacent to a coast. And again, it actually goes back into antiquity in terms of the process and the farming technique that surrounds shellfish farming. Again, prior to 2004, the specialty crop programs were administered, again, through the USDA to states, and states had discretion to determine specialty crop programs which they wanted to fund. In some instances, shellfish farming was included along with fruits and nuts and other forms of specialty crops. In 2004, Congress reformed this program or changed the program and gave specific definitions which take away that discretion to states in terms of the block grants program. And the block grants, in many instances, provide marketing assistance. Again, shellfish farming, oysters, clams, mussels, is a growing industry. In fact, it is, for people who become exposed to it, is considered a very high-quality industry in terms of U.S. shellfish that actually provides opportunities for export growth around the world. And what this amendment will do is really to give that, again, growing area of aquaculture an opportunity to expand and grow. And again, it affects the Pacific Coast, Gulf Coast, and the Eastern Coast. So again, this is really just, again, a cost-neutral amendment to extend very important marketing assistance and research assistance to a part of American agriculture, which clearly aquaculture is. Again, this is cultivated growing of food, unlike fishing. Again, I think for the hardworking men and women who get up every single day, just like dairy farmers or people who pick apples or other forms of specialty crops, who pay taxes, they should be allowed to have access to this program, a competitive grant program, which they would have to demonstrate their eligibility for. And again, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize myself for what time I might consume. While I appreciate the interest of the gentleman in advancing shellfish fishermen in their districts, I think the premise of their amendment is wrong. While other definitions of specialty crops may have included shellfish, the definition under the Specialty Crops Competitiveness Act was designed specifically for fruit, vegetable, and horticultural producers. The programs under this act were new, so nothing that shellfish were previously eligible for had been taken away by them. Being animals, shellfish have simply not been included in the program specifically designed for plant products. Now, while some minor aspects of the limited number of programs developed under the Specialty Crops Competitiveness Act may be generic enough that the addition of animal species would not be overly problematic, this definition has been used multiple times since 2004 in a variety of plant protection laws, and has been pointed out to the amendment sponsors, the simple modification of the definition they are seeking would create potentially massive confusion in a variety of critical programs. Therefore, as fond as I am of both authors, and as appreciative as I am of the product that they're attempting to endeavor, I must respectfully request that we oppose the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you. Again, first of all, I just want to
salute the great work the chairman of the committee has done. Again, it's been magnificent. It really has, to see regular order in this Congress. Secondly, I would just point out, though, that the 2004 specialty crop law was amended in the last Farm Bill in 2008 to add horticulture. So, again, what was done in 2004 is hardly a sacred text. I mean, we have the ability to, again, with good reason and evidence to amend this law. And again, I think given the history of it pre-2004, this is not an unreasonable change. To help make that point, I would now yield to my good friend from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Connecticut for yielding. Just as he said, this is really an effort just to modernize the list of eligible products under the Specialty Crops Competitiveness Act. It's just about making sure that those folks in rural coastal areas have the same opportunities as those farmers on land. In those coastal areas, shellfish, molluscan shellfish, are extraordinarily important as part of the economy. Modern practices take the watermen from wild harvest now to farming shellfish products just like on-land farmers do. What this does is it makes sure that those coastal economies have the same access to resources under this program as those farmers on land do. It really is just a situation of making sure that we have parity there. This doesn't add a new checkoff program. It doesn't add new taxes. It purely puts in place access to those dollars competitively, just like those farmers that farm other crops on land. Again, this is extraordinarily important to coastal communities in those areas where those watermen are now converting to being farmers on the water. So it really is, again, about making sure that we're fair in treating those farmers on the water the same as we do the farmers on the land. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to the gentleman from Connecticut.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize myself for whatever time that remains. There's a difference, I think, in the way the Act was created between animals and plants. I think this is an issue certainly that we need to address and look at, but I don't know in the context that it is put together here that this is an appropriate amendment. I would simply ask my colleagues in a very respectful fashion to decline this amendment, and with that I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Connecticut. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Speaker, I request yeas and nays.
Pursuant to clause... Does the gentleman request a recorded vote?
Sorry.
Thank you. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Connecticut will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 47, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 47, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Kind of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kind, and a member opposed will each control 10 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I offer this bipartisan amendment with my friend and colleague, Representative Petri from Wisconsin, that would call for further reforms and tightening up the crop insurance program. By the steps we take with this reform amendment, we've saved the American taxpayer over $11 billion over the next 10 years. It was based on bipartisan legislation that Representative Petri and I offered earlier this year that was supported by Representatives McGovern, Sensenbrenner, DeLauro, Radel, Blumenauer, Conyers, Cooper, DeFazio, Connolly, and Waxman, and supported by a variety of outside groups. What we're trying to do is maintain an element of risk in farming again, in a fiscally responsible manner, by tightening up crop insurance programs that we feel have become too excessive with the shifting of Title I commodity money and direct payments into the crop insurance category. We'd save over $11 billion over the next 10 years by doing the following. We call for a limit of federal crop insurance subsidies to $50,000 per farmer per year. Currently, there are no limits, no cap on the amount of taxpayer subsidies going to farm entities. Last year alone, over 26 entities received over $1 million in taxpayer premium subsidies alone. We think that's wrong, and we're trying to correct it with this amendment. We'd also extend the adjusted gross income limit of $250,000 per farm entity
to apply to crop insurance programs. The concept there is simple. If you're a farm entity with a gross profit of over $250,000, you really ought not still be receiving taxpayer subsidies. This is after you back out the operating expenses, the expenses of doing business. We're talking $250,000 worth of profit. It would promote crop insurance company efficiency by ending the 100% government subsidy of the administrative and operating costs that the private insurance companies currently enjoy today. Last year, we spent over $1.3 billion to these insurance companies just for their A&O expenses alone. We're asking them to live with a total spending of $900 million, which is consistent with what the Obama administration is offering in their budget. This would also guarantee that the crop insurance companies do not pass along the riskiest policies back to the American taxpayer, which is currently the practice. It would lower the profit guaranteed to these private insurance companies from 14% to 12%. We don't offer that type of guarantee for any other business in anywhere else in the country. And yet now they're guaranteed a 14% profit. We're saying, can you at least live with a 12% profit for the sake of some savings within this program? It would also promote transparency to help the taxpayer know where the money is going, who's benefiting from it. It opens the sunshine up so that we have greater disclosure of these programs and therefore greater scrutiny. So we think this is common sense reform. We think this is something that maintains the risk management tool of crop insurance. We're not proposing eliminating it, but we're just trying to propose making it more market sensitive and maintaining that element of risk. And finally, one of the reasons we feel this is so important is because of current commodity market prices, there's great pressure on farmers now to plant everywhere in the most fallow, highly sensitive, highly erodible land, because they know if they experience any loss, their loss is covered, and therefore the risk is taken out of it. That's leading to bad stewardship practices throughout our country. And with this reform, we're trying to introduce that element of some second-guessing, some risk in the most fallow, unproductive land that's right now being brought back into production. So I would encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Chris, is the gentleman from Oklahoma rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the Subcommittee Chairman of Primary Jurisdiction, Mr. Conaway of Texas, 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman, appreciate the yielding. I rise in strong opposition to this attack on a very important piece of the safety net that production agriculture relies upon. There are two possible outcomes for this amendment, and both are bad. The first is we're going to put the government back in the business of delivering crop insurance. We've tried that. It didn't work. The government employees don't act nearly as responsible as the private sector does. That comes with a cost, but it's the farmers that like it. They get response from these folks that is appropriate. The second, we'll go back to the possibility of the days when we would spend billions of dollars on unbudgeted ad hoc disaster relief. And that's the least efficient way that we ought to go on about this, and that's what this amendment does. It is bad for taxpayers, in spite of my colleagues' comments. This amendment won't save money. It'll end up costing us untold billions in this ad hoc disaster spending that's the norm in that regard. I know that the Environmental Working Group and other radical environmental groups want to run our farmers and ranchers out of business. I get that. This amendment would certainly help them accomplish their goal. So if your aim today is to stick the American taxpayer with billions of dollars to pay for ad hoc disaster bills, this is your kind of amendment. If you want to give the extreme environmentalist group, the crowd that gave us meatless Mondays, a win in their effort to ruin American farming and ranching families, this should get right at it. So I have farmers and ranchers struggling with 3 years of successive and severe drought. This is a slap in the face of those farmers and ranchers in West Texas and across this country. This amendment is not good, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 30 seconds. Unless my good friend wants to include the National Taxpayer Union, Taxpayers for Common Sense, Citizens Against Government Waste, Americans for Tax Reform, Committee for Responsible Taxation, American Commitment for the Center for Individual Liberty, R Street, Competitive Enterprise Institute, in that category of radical environmental groups, they've all come up in support, endorsing this legislation. But we're not taking the private insurance companies out. We're just asking them to carry some risk and to reduce their guaranteed profit margin from 14 to 12. And with that, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to my good friend and colleague from Wisconsin, Representative Petri.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank my colleague for yielding.
As the House considers the Farm Act of 2013, I believe it's important that we offer the proper support for farmers while ensuring that these support programs are responsible for the American taxpayer. As you may know, the federal crop insurance program is the most expensive government program supporting farm income and is the only farm income support program that is not subject to some form of payment limitation or means testing. This amendment, which incorporates the language in the AFFIRM Act that Representative Kine and I introduced last month, works to reform the crop insurance program. Capping crop insurance subsidies at $50,000 per person per year does not prohibit farmers from purchasing crop insurance, nor does it eliminate all taxpayer support for the program. In fact, most farmers would not be affected by this cap at all. According to the GAO, in 2011, only 4% of farmers would have been impacted by this $50,000 cap on subsidy for insurance. For 2001 to 2012, the total cost of premium subsidies jumped fourfold from $1.8 billion to $7.5 billion. The Congressional Budget Office projects even higher costs in the future, averaging $9.1 billion annually. The subsidy cap, combined with the $250,000 means testing requirement, will assist in preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal crop insurance program. This amendment also reforms administrative and operating reimbursements. Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
That the government pays to private insurance companies by capping those payments at $900 million, which is a fairly moderate cap and below what's currently being spent. It also lowers the reimbursement to insurance companies to the President's target of 12% return from 14% return.
Is the balance of his time?
Reserve the balance.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.